International. So here we are. This is a function of the International Psychoanalytic Association. Perhaps we can put up our slides. This is the IPA Journal Club. Our guest today is Dr. Tarek El-Ariss. Next slide, please. I'm Jack Drescher. I'm the moderator. You've probably seen my bio if you signed up for this. Next slide. So I wanted to let everybody know, this is our 8th journal club. This is our 2nd academic year doing the journal club. All of our previous journal clubs are available for viewing either at the IPA website or on the YouTube. IPA has a YouTube channel, and D'Agostine will put the link for the IPA YouTube channel, and you can view some of the previous journal clubs with people like Jay Greenberg, Jonathan Shedler, Beverly Stout, Daniel Knafo. Next slide. So here we go. So our guest today is Dr. Tarek El-Ariss, who is the James Wright Professor and Chair of Middle Eastern Studies at Dartmouth College. He was born and raised in Beirut during the Civil War there in Lebanon from 1975 to 1990. And trained in psychoanalysis, philosophy, and comparative literature. His work deals with questions of displacement, war, and desire, and he has written about disoriented travelers, outcasts, queers, hackers, and characters with complicated relations to home and power. He is the author of several books, including Trials of Arab Modernity, Literary Affects in the New Political, and Leaks, Hacks, and Scandals, Arab Culture in the Digital Age. He's editor of the Arab Renaissance, a bilingual anthology of the Nada, and his work has been reviewed in the Times Literary Supplement, and Choice. And in 2021, he received a Guggenheim Fellowship to complete his war memoir, which we'll be discussing a chapter of today, from the Other Press. The next slide. So if the chapter we've distributed, this is the actual book. It's very moving. Next slide. So some guidelines about how we conduct the journal club for those who've not been here. We want it to be interactive so that you, the audience, can speak directly with authors. And the session is being recorded, and like the previous journal club sessions, will be available for viewing on both the IPA website and on the IPA's YouTube channel within a week or two, usually. If you do not wish to be recorded, you can leave your camera off. But if you don't want to be recorded, I may not call on you to ask a question, because we like to have the questioners, on the recording speaking directly to the author. Next slide. If you have questions or comments, put them in the Q&A section. We're not using the chat function for this meeting. And so I will be monitoring the Q&A section for questions or comments. And we've muted you all for this event, when you're called upon to pose your question, we will unmute you. I think we've disabled the self-muting function, but we'll work that out. Next slide. If I call on you, please unmute yourself, or we'll unmute you, and then turn on your video camera if it's not already on. And when I call on you, please identify yourself and tell us where you're coming from. This is an international meeting. We get people from all over the world. It's quite interesting. And because we get people from all over the world, please speak slowly and clearly when you do, because not everybody on this call is a native English speaker. And if you haven't downloaded the papers yet, Agustin is going to put the link to download the paper again in the chat. Hopefully you will have read it. I found it very moving. I think that's our last slide. Yes, Agustin? Yes, thank you. Terrific. Okay, so I have my notes, Tarek, so I'm going to just do that. Here we go. So Tarek, where are you today? Tell everybody where you are.
I am at Phillips Exeter Academy in New Hampshire. And I'm here with my colleague, Susanna Heschel. We co-teach a course at Dartmouth called The Arab, the Jew, and the Construction of Modernity, which is about 19th century formation of the subject. And as you might imagine, this topic is very in demand right now. and is on a lot of people's radar. So we were invited to give a talk about our collaboration at Dartmouth and how we work together.
Yes.
So I just finished, we finished our public lecture, and now I'm in an office,
Right.
to meet with you all.
And I'm going to talk to you about your work with Susanna, later, but I'll start with an easy question. So what motivated you to write a memoir?
Well, huh. Well, a few years back, I work with a lot of artists from the region, especially from the Middle East. And sometimes when artists invite you, they don't want you to do like a close reading or a deconstruction. I'm a literary scholar, a deconstruction of text. They want you to do something a little more, sometimes personal, engaging with topic. And the first article I wrote was The Beachcomber, which is chapter 2 in the book. It's about the sea in Beirut, and it's about this idea of going to the beach every day during the war. And so after I wrote this chapter, I said, there is a book there. This was 10 years ago. But then I said, okay, maybe after I finish my tenure and all of these academic hoops that we have to jump, eventually I'll do it towards the end of my career. But then COVID happened, and I had like a plan for the book, and one chapter was going to be on water and water scarcity and how we dealt with water scarcity and food shortages during the war in Lebanon. And so this is the anxiety that overwhelmed me when the lockdown started. It brought me back to that place that was very familiar to me, where the unpredictability of the lockdown, of that disease that we didn't know how it was transmitted, how it affected us, it brought me back to the state of growing up during the war in Lebanon. And immediately the third chapter in the book, it's called Sediments, it just came out of me, really like gushed out of me. It just, I sat down and I just wrote it. And I shared it with some friends, and they said, Tarek, you need to, this is the time to write the book. This is the time for it. So I applied for the Guggenheim, and I got a year off, and I wrote the book. But this is kind of the context for it.
Got it. And the follow-up question that occurred to me was, what was the experience like in writing a memoir about trauma? Because, I actually once wrote a chapter that, for a book about my family experiences of trauma, and it was quite difficult. So what was that like for you?
It was, I mean, for me, writing as in general is difficult. I mean, writing is, especially when you're not writing. I mean, all my writing, even my academic books, although they're not necessarily about me, but there is a me in what I write. When I write about these disoriented travelers in Europe in the 1820s, or when I write about, certain characters in novels, I mean, it's there is something that takes a lot of you, of emotional, not just simply intellectual engagement, but also emotional as well. And the experience afterwards, it's really it's very draining. It's really, it takes a lot. It takes a lot of you. So to do it for yourself, to do it like basically to put yourself on the couch, and I mean, this is. I would write and come and take breaks because I would feel like a kind of an emotional exhaustion afterwards. So I would write a chapter. I write every day, like, and I need totally to disconnect. Like, this is why the time off is very important. Disconnect emotionally. I mean, I'm living with my partner in Boston. So I said, I'm sorry, you're gonna see me in a state, because this is the first time he sees me writing. You're gonna see me in a state where I'm not gonna be present, and don't be scared. Don't take it personally. But I have to be with the text. I have to be with the writing.
And let me interrupt. Your writing is done in isolation. I mean, you don't do writing groups or, consult with other writers while you're working on a project.
So the way I write the chapter, I do it in isolation. I edit, and then at some point I send it out to my interlocutors, and I have a few of them. And then they send me their comments, and I incorporate their comments, and then I move to another chapters. That's how I write. So I produce one chapter at the time, and I'm kind of in that zone. Every chapter really is really a state of being. It's not, it's a kind of it has its own mood, it has its own tone, humor, sadness, all of this. And so I send at the end. And then after I write all the chapters, and sometimes I end up adding a chapter, like in this book, I added 2 chapters that I wasn't planning on writing. And then I start editing I put it all together in one document, and I start editing it all as one manuscript, which I then send. So there are a lot of although this is technically not a peer-reviewed book, but it is very peer-reviewed through this process of actually sending and this intersubjective, this encounter with someone else's perspective who sees, like I sent it to Mazen Khalid, Mazen, my friend, whose dad was killed in an explosion in Lebanon, who was the Mufti of Lebanon. So his reaction to one of my chapter on 1982 was very different from my colleagues' reaction to 1982, to the chapter on 1982, the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, 1982.
Mm-hmm.
So it's also, you're dealing with people who also have sometimes feeling about what you write.
Mm-hmm.
And so at multiple levels, that's why I kind of I feel like I've constantly moving between the position of the analyst and the analysant. I'm constantly going back and forth between these 2 positions, because I also have to construct myself as a character and
Yeah.
go
So
back. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say that so the image that came to mind is object relation. That you have you have many different audiences in your head to whom you are speaking, and they all don't hear the same words that you're saying in the same way. I wanted another question, and anybody in the audience that I'd like to encourage you to speak up if you have any questions for Tarek. But the thing that you're the first guest of the Journal Club who did not actually train as a psychoanalyst. And so, could you say something about how your thoughts and feelings about psychoanalysis as a
Yeah.
patient and as a scholar influence your own scholarship?
Yeah, my answer would be I was raised by psychoanalysis. I feel like I'm like Remus and Remus and Romulus, in Rome. Jack. I mean, I want to acknowledge also my analyst in New York, Nancy Wolf, who's on the call, and Jack Drescher, of course. The relation is, we're neighbors in New York, and even the book starts with me, kind of my brother reading Freud and coming to my parents and saying, you should do this and not that, otherwise the Oedipus is gonna be all messed up. So there is the story with psychoanalysis is really very old. And then as a literary critic, I worked a lot on psychoanalysis, especially the work of French analyst Jacques Lacan, which was very important in literary scholarship. Of course, Freud as well, and then I started my analysis in New York in 2001, which I talk about in the book. So I'm always speaking from the position of psychoanalysis, both as a reader, as an analysant, but also as someone who has an insight as well as a result of all of this. So I'm always kind of in dialogue with psychoanalysis, this is throughout my academic work as well. I mean, I bring in different theoretical models. Like I worked also a lot on affect theory and other kind of theoretical frameworks, but I'm always in dialogue with psychoanalysis, which you see in this book. And in a way, this book is kind of a dialogue between psychoanalysis, Middle Eastern studies, I mean, trauma theory, which also is something that I worked on both academically and obviously it turns out I was also experiencing it as I eventually realized when I start my analysis in New York, and I talk about this in the book. There are multiple encounters and engagements with psychoanalysis that are coming, maybe not in the kind of the most, recognizable form, at least, that,
Yeah, so what I hear is that you're saying is that you write with a psychoanalytic sensibility.
absolutely.
I know, for example, I give some talks in which there's not one word of psychoanalytic jargon, but I consider them to be psychoanalytic talks because they're organized in a way that the complexity of psychoanalysis allows me to do. So it's about the sensibility that psychoanalysis can provide to in communication that is not part of normal communication.
And also, like, and this is something that I got to realize after, when you come out of a state of war, like the Lebanese Civil War, which was a reality for 15 years. I mean, all I knew was war. And psychoanalysis is a very powerful system to organize subjectivity. When subjectivity has been so baffled by the unpredictability of war, and it's not just simply the bombs that fall and you have to escape. I mean, it's an existential unpredictability. It's an existential form of displacement that fundamentally, breaks down you unsettle your bearings as a subject who needs to rely on certain relations that are fixed or certain forms of temporality. I'm going to go to school tomorrow. It's going to be open. Uh, you book, you make plans to go somewhere. The airport is not going to close because they started fighting again. You even leave your house and you're going to be able to come back to your house. I mean, the basic forms of what we need to create kind of a stable subject, over time. That is something that I've come to realize has been shattered in fundamental ways. So psychoanalysis, like I think the attraction of psychoanalysis for me early on is also it provides a kind of theoretical framing that organizes, that gives me the language to think about the subject in a way that is more stable or than what I have experienced. So
Well, this is contextualization. This is a little bit like Roy Schaefer's idea, that it helps you develop a narrative, that makes sense of what to a child, of course, must have been quite incomprehensible. Actually, to many of us adults, is quite incomprehensible in terms of what's going on. I reread, the chapter again this morning, and I think this being which is called 911. And of course, this week is the anniversary of 911. I don't know if that was coincidence or not. I mean, it was unconscious that, when we selected this date in that chapter. But, and of course, I have my own, I was here September 11th in New York City, and I spent the day trying to find something to do. So I signed up with the Red Cross, as a kind of way to sort of like not feel so helpless during a horrible moment here in New York City. But I was thinking as I read the chapter, I love the part about, how you went out, everybody came to your apartment and you just took care of everything, because, as of course, my partner is from Beirut too. And he and I met during the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982 with relatives on both sides of that border. And so we, of course, have a very complicated relationship to the things that go on there. But, like you, he also, like when he figures out what to do, he's a survivor. So we're really talking about survivor and survival skills, which are really, really, really important.
yeah.
I wanted to ask you another question about, well, the question related to the 911 is, how are you doing this week with 911, given the re-traumatization experience?
I have to say something also interesting, serendipitous happened to me, but I just came back from Rome, and I came back from Rome on 9/11, and
Mhm.
and I had signed up, global entry. This is the system in the US that expedites your entrance and exit from across the border in the United States. And I've resisted applying for global entry because I was always afraid they're going to ask me all these questions like, where are you born? And Beirut, fears about terrorism and background. So I actually, although I fly like crazy, but I never really applied for it. I always was anxious that maybe they're going to scrutinize me too much or something. But I finally did it like a month ago, and then they have a system now. So I got approved, and they have a system now where you do the interview upon entry. So when you entered the United States, so on 9/11, I did my interview for the global entry, which is something that I had resisted for a long time because of the anxiety it was producing in me.
And were they nice to you during the interview?
Yes, I mean, I flirted with the agent a little bit. He had very nice tattoos, so I complimented him on his tattoos, and he asked me if I was thinking of getting tattoos, and I said I'm thinking about it, although I'm not thinking about it at all. And basically, he just asked me like, "What do you do?" I said, "Well, I teach the chair of Middle Eastern Studies at Dartmouth." He's like, I said, "I teach literature." He said, "Oh, okay, interesting." And he just fingers here, fingerprints there, and then it was like so innocuous. It was so, so simple. But this is 9/11. And then of course, I was flying, I was aware I'm flying on 9/11. And anyway, so there was a bit of that, but not more. But I felt like there is a full circle that happened on 9/11.
So again, I have another. I've prepared lots of questions. But I would really love to hear from people in the audience at some point. But I was going to the next thing that came up. Susanna Heschel, who I know is with you there at Exeter Academy. I don't know if everybody knows this, but the two of you have been on the news, CNN, PBS, newspapers, speaking around the world due to the amazing work that the two of you were doing at Dartmouth. And I know that both of you have deep connections to psychoanalytic thinking, even though neither of you is a clinician. And I also know you've been invited, and I've invited both of you to speak to psychoanalysts about the difficulty of talking to each other, particularly these days around emotionally fraught topics. So I was just wondering, do you have any observations of the clinicians or the psychoanalysts you've been talking to regarding what you see as some of the obstacles within them? As both individuals and organizations that makes it difficult for them to talk about fraught topics like Israel-Gaza?
Well, I mean, I think, what we've been discussing in the previous forums, Jack, that you organized. I mean, I think, one of the main question is an issue is how much do you bring of yourself into the conversation, either as a professor or as a therapist, as an analyst.
Mhm.
And either your reaction to what the patient might say or the student might say or how you're feeling about it, or whether you feel you have to acknowledge something and bring it into consciousness, bring it into the session. And this is what we've been doing and thinking about and talking to other people about, is that what kind of balance do we have to make between where I don't feel I can't say what I think, but at the same time, I don't want to come and tell the students this is what's going on and this is what you have to think. So, and I feel like our engagement with psychoanalysis, and we both were in analysis for parts of our lives, has given us also the tools to make room for the other, to listen and also not to feel that, and recognize where the I stops and the other begins. And so this kind of balancing act has been fundamental to the success of our class. And also I studied, French theory. And so, my engagement with Holocaust studies, with trauma theory, it's all based on that. I worked with people who specialize in this. So I kind of know, not just simply, I don't represent the Arab perspective, or she's representing the Jewish perspective, and she works on, the rise of Islamic studies in Europe by Jewish scholars in the 19th century, how Jewish scholars basically started Islamic studies. So the intersections and the ability to understand where each other comes from has been really very important for us. And I think psychoanalysis and the kind of the tools and the forms of listening and engagement that psychoanalysis provides have been essential for us.
Yes, but my question was more, what do you perceive at the on the side when you spoke to the we had two psychoanalytic gatherings, one at the William Alison White Institute and the other one at the NYU postdoctoral program. I was one, and I think you've had others around the country as well. But what is your perception of what the analysts are struggling with, who are on this? That's the question. What are you seeing? Because I'm very indebted to interpersonal relational theories like Ferenczi. And Ferenczi, said the patient is analyzing the analyst at the same time the analyst is analyzing the patient.
I mean, I need to spend more time with psychoanalysts, Jack, and talk to them more about this. I mean, we only had two events, but it is basically what I was telling you and what we had discussed. It is again this idea of how much to bring in. I felt like this is what the analysts were struggling with. It is the space or certain feelings about what's going on that is coming into the session and how that plays out. But I can't really make a more detailed diagnosis beyond that.
No, I wasn't asking for detailed diagnosis as much
Yeah.
as perceptions and the experience of it. All right. Anybody else? Anybody feel like responding, reacting? I feel like I don't want to hog this whole meeting. Okay. All right. So here's something. So
Jack, Naila is.
Oh yes.
Hello everyone. Tarek, I'm sorry I didn't read your book because I didn't get the chapter, but I will definitely do so. Actually, I am a psychoanalyst. I'm a training analyst living and working in Beirut. And I'm speaking to you all from Beirut right now. So everything you said was extremely interesting for me. I'd like to add maybe something about the last point. What do we as analysts, how do we work in an atmosphere of war and in a place where like you, I have lived through the Civil War, and of course, for 45 years, I lived and worked abroad, not in Lebanon, and returned in 2018 to work with Lebanese patients. And 2 years later, there was the explosion of the port. And of course, this has reactivated so many things. And I wasn't here, thank God. It was August, I was away. I had just taken my holiday. However, my office was completely destroyed. And I could have been there at 6 o'clock in the evening. So basically, the difficulty, of course, the airport, the war, today, I don't know if tomorrow we'll be able to fly out of Lebanon or not. And it's the same with my patients. So the difficulty is to work where we're sharing a trauma, a collective trauma. And that puts off the symmetry in the transference, counter-transference relationship. And it has a huge impact on what happens in the treatment, because we are constantly bombarded by external reality. And it's very, very difficult to, first of all, keep the neutral position, the position of an analyst. When we ourselves, and even though we've been analyzed and analyzed and analyzed, still feel the trauma in our body. Yes, Ferenczi talks about it and others. Trauma is inscribed. It's like a tattoo. The only difference is that you can't remove it. So what I did, which is very helpful in terms of trying to, elaborate and work through this very present problem of Gaza and Israel, I became part of a forum of collective trauma at the EPF, so the European Federation of Psychoanalysis. It's an IPA group, and we are about 6 or 7 analysts, mainly training analysts, and some with a history of the Shoah, and some like me with a history of, on top of everything, my mother is Palestinian. So it's the only way to deal with it, is to talk. And the answer about Jack asked, is there a problem within the analytic world today? Yes, there is. It came out very clearly during the EPF. There is a regression. The other becomes a threat. It is very difficult right now for an analyst to be able to to reach out. For example, we can't reach out to our Israeli colleagues. During the big conferences, the conversations are very complicated. So I think I can go on and on, but I'll let
I just like to respond to something that you said. When September 11th happened here in New York, we then proceeded to work and see our patients. And we, the therapists here in New York, the analysts, had all been traumatized too. And there was somehow this fantasy that we had better coping skills than everybody else, from a trauma like that, which was, of course, was absurd, because none of us who had not experienced an attack like that prior to that time had ever experienced anything like that. And so the one thing that I think that's an advantage, so part of my training is, relational, interpersonal, where being able to be self-disclosing and being able to tell the patient, what's going on at your end is not forbidden. In a way, maybe it's a little bit easier than having to be, the blank screen who supposedly is unaffected by external events, when of course none of us are unaffected by external events. But that was my thought when you were speaking.
Well, we still, yes, you're right. I still think that it is not totally symmetrical, because we have tools that the patients don't have. And we have been able, hopefully, to connect to our good internal objects. And that is something that often the patients don't have yet. So it does give us an advantage. But we need to pause, and there is an après coup in all that. There is a time of working through and elaborating, and we have our tools where there are colleagues from other associations or supervisors.
Right. Tarek, you have any thoughts?
Well, thank you, Naila. I think it's the tattoo that you mentioned. I mean, it's not that the tattoo on the, immigration officer that encountered on Wednesday. But I talk about, there is an episode in the book about someone who gets shot. And the bullet, they can't extract the bullet from his head. And he has to live with that bullet for the rest of his life. And he's in a vegetative state. And I say, this is the tattoo. This is the trauma. It is you know that there is a bullet in the back of your head. And sometimes you forget about it. Sometimes you pretend it's not there. Sometimes it burns you and you have to acknowledge it. So it is not a kind of a monolithic presence. It is not a monolithic inscription. It is dynamic. It reacts, it acts, it subsides. And I think this is the trauma, I think, that you're talking about. And this is where I say, like, the book ends with that, is that how do we live with this, and how do we, without the possibility of salvation or cure or therapy. And this is why, you know, I mean, for me, psychoanalysis is so important, because it's an ongoing process. Although I'm not, you know, going through analysis right now, but writing the book is a continuation of my analysis in some way. And so to go back to Jack's question about why writing this book, I mean, this is also a time when I was making a demand to, you know, to go back on the couch in some way, but I was also in Hanover, New Hampshire, so it was a bit complicated. Although today, in the world of Zoom and virtual virtual encounters, I guess it's you know, distances and geographies don't matter. But I'm old school.
Thank you, Naya, for your participation. Michael, could you tell people where you are, who you are? Michael Feldman?
Sorry,
Oh, okay.
am I
Yes, we hear you.
present? Okay.
Yes. Could you let everybody know who you are, where you are?
I'm Michael Feldman in New York, across the street from Jack Drescher at this moment. Thank you, Naila, for your very open and personal and also resonating experience, a resonant experience. This is an area of personal interest and also professional, as I work with survivors and descendants of many traumas, but primarily the Holocaust and European war related, but not only Jewish, also non-Jewish. And I actually can't get to the patients because you have reactivated personal experience that I feel the need to share, because it so mirrors your own. Each of you, though, I think the two of you have share many similarities. I would say in categories we're very different, but when I read the chapter last night, what also struck me was, and it's beautiful, is how similar it is, to me at least, to material I read written by Jewish survivors of the period of National Socialism, among others. Certainly in the sense that something happens that, as you say, gradually, but I'm sure perhaps even like those bullets, activated the disjointed memories, as you called them, that started rushing in, and I would say, in my experience of them, force us to revisit ghosts that we really don't want to revisit. In that sense, I think Naila's point was well taken. We have, as analysts, hopefully we have tools that our patients don't yet, or we wouldn't have a job. You know, they wouldn't need us. But those advantages don't always immunize us.
Good point.
And you know, anyone who didn't learn that from the HIV epidemic learned it from the next set of traumas, and the same on 9/11. I want to mention that, which I wasn't going to, because it's so relevant to Jack's points about psychoanalysis and the comments about what happens to analysts when historical or collective traumas occur. We lived, Jack and I at least, 9/11 in New York, though our experiences were different. I learned about what was happening from my patients because I was starting at, I might have started at 8 a.m. at the time because I was in training. And each patient at 8, 9, and 9 and 10 and 11 were giving me different versions of what was going on. I was on the Upper West Side, far from where the trauma was, and I would have had no idea looking out my window until I finished at 11:15, let's say, when I could finally look outside. I'm on Central Park West, which is miles away from Ground Zero, and there was a mass of people in the street walking north. They were walking home, but they were walking away from Ground Zero. And as everyone did that day, and maybe after, were walking because there was no train, there were no cars. I had never seen a sight like that. The snippets I heard, of course, evolved over those 3 hours to, I think a plane hit the World Trade Center, or something happened at the World Trade Center. I think it was a plane. And with the patient and I explored it, and we imagined a tiny, single engine propeller flown by an amateur pilot enthusiast, something that we couldn't imagine what actually had happened. And I think that is the real, I'm sure, as Lacan would say, beyond our imagination at the time. And by the third of the 3, they said there was a terrorist attack on the World Trade Center. It's awful, this happened, but I don't want to talk about it. I have other things to talk about. What I want to say as a way of making a contribution is that I was still in supervision at the time with a very senior Jewish analyst, a very senior analyst who was a child survivor from Vienna. And I happened to be working on a project about this person's family at the moment. And that's a group of people, because they escaped before the war and they lived through a period when there weren't labels like child survivor. That's from the 90s. This was after, but by then they were well into late life and didn't take up that language. And never spoke, had a thick Viennese accent, but never spoke German with me. So I tried to invite her to do so. Did invite me to eat ham sandwiches every week because that's just what she had for lunch. And we had this unspoken war. We had this unspoken struggle with each other to do things the other wouldn't do or couldn't do that had something to do with being tattooed with a Jewish, let's say, a Jewish trauma. She supervised me on the case where the third patient was a man, said, this is what happened, but I don't want to talk about it, who was not Jewish, but had a profound dream after this, after the attack.
Michael, forgive me. Could you be more concise and get to the point? Thank you.
Because I wasn't planning to say that.
No, I understand. It's emotional.
A dream that involved Orthodox Jews, and whom he both admired and despised. He envied and thought that because I'm Jewish, of course, I lost people in the towers. Now, I'm fortunate I didn't lose people in the towers, but I lost something, as we all did, when those towers fell. In supervision, we talked about this, but we never talked about my experience as a Jew on that day, my experience as a Jew, my inherited familial and cultural history as a Jew, or hers. And I just want to say that it was evidence to me, and now I can think about it, I almost couldn't at the time, that we never spoke about it in terms of how to understand this patient and how to work with this patient in 2001. Because
I would add, Michael, I would add, our last journal club was with Emily Kuriloff, whose book was Psychoanalysis and the Legacy of the Third Reich. And in her interviews with analysts who had survived either as adults, well, adolescents or as adults, young adults or children, that there was a wish not to talk about it at all. That was actually a rather common reaction to sort of act as if this is not only in their work, but also in their theorizing. That in the United States, this was a group of people who theorized what the relationalists call a one-person image of the mind, that the mind in isolation from external circumstances other than the first 3 years of life.
And based on a psychic economy.
Yes. Right.
Ecopsychology and its psychic economies.
Tarek, do you have any thoughts about what Michael said?
Yeah, I mean, what I try to communicate in this chapter is that, there is also an erotic pleasure in that feeling of absolute terror.
Excitement.
Absolutely. And this is what what I think my book is trying to say is that, the structure of desire is tied to this. And it's not just simply about loss and mourning and trauma and the collective. Of course, that too. But there is also an exhilaration as well that comes back in these moments of absolute terror, that the closeness to the other is not just simply I want to be protected by them, but I also want to be with them. And these are the narratives of the people that I constructed and said, this is the community, and we basically continued to party throughout. So how do you account for that? And how do you talk about that? We also kind of did performed the Bin Laden and his wives and dressed up but it's there was also theater as part of this, as bringing this on to also deal with it and embody it and externalize it at the same time. So
yes.
So you want to go there, and that's something that we also need to acknowledge here, and it's not always comfortable to do so, but that's the reality.
And there, I think, as the analyst can lead in a way by example, perhaps, with our patients. Our tattoos involve both psyche and soma. And I agree that it doesn't go away. It's how we understand and integrate.
We have Gabriella's hand raised, so please, why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us where you are.
Okay.
Thank you, Michael.
So Gabriella Shelley, I also am in New York now and was in New York on 9/11, the original 9/11. The thing I wanted to share with regard to how do analysts deal with something that they are feeling traumatized by as well. I did a little report when I'm at NIPSI. I'm a psychoanalyst. I'm a member of NIPSI and also a psychiatrist.
Tell everybody what NIPSI is. Only we New Yorkers know what that means.
The New York Psychoanalytic Society and Institute. So it's one of the institutes in New York City. Anyway, and I was a candidate also at the time. And actually, I went to supervision, and that's when we heard together that the Pentagon had been hit in my supervision. And then we just basically said, we just talked, we stopped doing work completely. But in terms of how we deal with these things as analysts, and when we're in the same situation, I think it's helpful to know that Freud himself was pretty bad at it. And I did a little paper about Dora when I was a candidate, and I guess we were looking at, hysteria, and we were asked to do an assignment something that we found interesting. So I decided to look a little bit more at the Dora case and did some reading about it, and learned that Dora, which was somewhat of a failed case, and there was a lot of writing about why did it fail and what was going on, and what was Freud blind to in the work with her. She was a Jew. And a year after she stopped working with Freud, she converted to Catholicism. And anti-Semitism was rampant in Vienna in 1903, when she was in treatment in 1904. And it struck me as interesting that that was something that never came up in the treatment, and nothing that nothing that either one of them ever spoke about or was an important part of the transaction between them, and something that they were clearly in the midst of together. So, Freud himself was not able to really find a way to talk about those things with his patients either. So that was one thing. The other thing is that I remember around 9/11 also being a candidate, that it was hard for me. I felt a little bit like it's the blind leading the blind. Like, if I'm as scared as my patients are, why are they lying here? Why even stay? Like, if I don't have anyway. So
any thoughts in relationship to what you read in the chapter in terms of?
Oh, I loved the chapter. I felt I could relate. I mean, like Michael, I'm a child of 2 concentration camp survivors. So a lot of it felt very, it was beautifully written, and I found it incredibly poignant. And it felt also in some ways familiar to me, that there are these dichotomies. And you talked a little bit just now about theater and the excitement of, but that it's very mixed. It's not a straightforward experience, and can be very confusing.
Tarek, any response? No. Okay. Thank you. Candela, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us where you are? I mean, I know, but.
Hi, Jack. Hi, Tarek. My name is Candela Bonacorso. I'm a psychologist. I am also a graduate of the William Alanson White Institute. I'm a psychoanalyst. My question is a little bit about process, and if the chapter was attached somewhere, I missed it, so I would love to read it. When I work with patients around trauma, I always have the imagery of glass shattering and the discontinuity of life experience, like trauma as an outlier, and part of the work being kind of somehow weaving into the life experience the trauma. And so I am curious as to, when you wrote, if you found yourself surprised by what was coming out of you, or if you struggled with a way to integrate these kinds of shards of glass type experience to make it make sense, and if it felt, sorry, so many if it felt like you could make it flow because you're an excellent writer, or if it even for you was a struggle to tell the story, to tell the narrative without almost disorganizing in your mind.
See, this is because this is the first time I write a book that is not like an academic book. I'm usually very organized, everything fits, everything has to somehow connect. And here, some of the advice I got as I was writing the different chapters is that, Tarek, don't impose the academic order on this. Also, let this let the free association also take its course. And this is for me, like I teach a literary theory course, a graduate course in literary theory, and usually I start with interpretation of dreams. Because for me, this is kind of where there is that kind of associative process that you then recognize, and then you start kind of bringing in some order into it, or bringing it into some meaning making process. So this is kind of my experience here. But throughout the book, I mean, I found myself reconciling with my dad. I mean, in my analysis, the emphasis was a lot about my mom. And I kind of mentioned it in the chapter. I said, I go to analysis to deal with mom, and then the war comes up. But the book kind of also, I lost my dad. I was a teenager, and I was kind of very angry at him because he abandoned me. That's how I internalized that. That's how I dealt with it. So the book, I found myself reconciling with my dad, bringing my dad as an interlocutor, dealing with storytelling, dealing with kind of the things, sometimes even stories that I wasn't sure that they were true or not, and I could tell already as a child. So when you need an image of the father that is kind of fixed, that is secure, that is stable, that is constant. So I kind of reconciled with these issues in the book, and I surprised myself. But the most, to come back to this question of the shattered glass, there is a chapter, I mean, to talk about 1982, very powerful, very, horrible year. And I want to talk about the experience of living in West Beirut, which is the closest thing that we have today to what's going on now, because we're like encircled and really being bombarded. The food, I mean, it was awful. And of course, Sabra and Shatila massacres happened, towards the end of that summer. So basically, I didn't know how to start this chapter. I didn't know how to open it up, and I had a dream as I was struggling with this chapter. I had a dream, and the dream, I was in this dark hallway at night, and I started seeing light, like colors in one corner, and then I realized, and this Lebanese painter, poet that I love, that I know, her name is Etel Adnan. She had just died, and she and I thought it was her coming in the dream, and she revealed herself. And then I understood, because I teach one of her books called The Arab Apocalypse, which starts with the colors, with kind of, it's a surrealist poems where the writing is also exploding, is shattering. And she starts red, white, yellow, red, green, and it's almost like Rimbaud-esque, for those who know French literature. So that's how I start the chapter. I start the chapter with the goldfish, because, and the chapter is called The Fish Tank, because it is the goldfish, and something happens to the goldfish at the end, but I won't say, because I don't want to also ruin the chapter for those who might read it. But that's how I processed, that's how I entered into beginning to describe this most painful experience of the war. It came to me through kind of a literary association that has to do with what I read, but also she wrote that chapter, and that chapter, her language broke down when she was living 1982 and interacting with it. She was living in the Bay Area at the time. So this is kind of one example of how the kind of the associations come, but the unconscious also operate and draw on other texts, also intertextuality, come to bring in the fragments and also give you some sense of how to organize them or use them to also enter or to begin to speak or to represent something that is unrepresentable or that is very difficult to actually capture in words. So her inability to capture the apocalypse kind of really gave me the ability to do so in some way. I don't know if that answers your question, but this is This is one notion of process or bringing these fragments together.
Thank you.
I thank you for your question, Candela. I actually conversation moves in a direction that I thought this was the last question I came up with. You used a term in the chapter called the algorithm of identity, which is a term I found very compelling, particularly based on my own work in the area of gender identities and my own thinking about the subjectivity of all identities. I was doing an educational session for a group of Orthodox Jewish people who wish to be supportive of trans members in their community. And somebody said something about, well, isn't that identity subjective? I say all identities are subjective. You know, our Jewish identities are subjective. And then you wrote something which I thought of, and this is to quote you: the Francophone academic performing gender and sexuality across 4 continents was now drawing to its end. I could no longer turn to Freud and Camus to explain where I came from and who I was. I had to reinvent myself as Muslim and Arab, but I was going on to do it my way. And then you go on to say something that I also talk about, binary identities. And this is quoting you again: I declared war on those binaries that could never account for the community of strangers to which I proudly belong. And I guess I just want you to elaborate a bit on your thinking about algorithms of identity.
You know, it's, I mean, especially after 9/11, I mean, you had to basically own up to whatever it is you are. You had the FBI coming to my friend's house because of whatever he was posting in the early email list. I mean, all of a sudden you have in Beirut, the Muslim neighborhood putting American flags, thinking you're in some, 4th of July parade, just to say that, it's not us, we have nothing to do with this. So there is this kind of guilt by association that needs to be confronted. And of course, I mean, I come from Lebanon, you live with the Lebanese French system, very complicated identity. Even the book, my dad was raised by a Christian, my mom went to Protestant school, she's American English speaking. I mean, it's like and also identity as something that is fixed, at least for us in Lebanon. This is the Civil War, because this is when you accept the claim of your ethnic and sectarian and regional identity and say, here's the machine gun, go and fight for your village and go fight for your tribe.
And you had no choice really in that particular conflict. Everybody was forced to either accept an identity or leave.
Exactly. And I mean, but the book is about resisting that. And there are all these episodes when my dad is kidnapped by these militiamen, and then he's seducing them, and he does this whole, he says, okay, you have to kidnap me, but then, I need the cabinet to see patients because he's an OBGYN. So he said, so there is this whole dance around, like, how do you survive in a place like this while refusing to submit to the claims of sectarian violence and sectarian identification.
Yeah.
And this is, and this is for me, like, and then that's why 9/11, what I'm saying. So, the Francophone academic, queer, moving across these circles is also a space. And the stranger, the idea of stranger, this is very important in Arabic, by the way. Of course, I'm playing on Camus, l'étranger, right? But also the idea of the gharib, al-ghuraba in Arabic is a very important concept. It is this, this very complex relation to home, to belonging. And you find it in pre-Islamic texts already. And you even have a beautiful chronicle in the Middle Ages, by Asfahani, called Kitab al-Ghuraba, the Book of Strangers. It's these people who write graffiti on walls, who have left home because they did not belong. That's why I say I work on people who have complicated relation to home. Hackers and leakers. I'm interested in these figures who don't quite fit. So when I say, I'm gonna do it my way, it means, okay, you want me to own up to it? I'm gonna redefine what it means to be Muslim and Middle Eastern. And this is what I'm doing. This is where my move from comparative literature and really French literature, compared very European training in philosophy and literary theory, to Arabic, because also after 9/11, this is where the jobs were. And it's very hard to get a job for in the humanities in general. But I said, okay, I'm gonna hack it. I'm gonna deconstruct it. This is what I'm doing, but look at how I'm gonna do it.
Got it.
And I brought into it psychoanalysis and deconstruction and all the things I've learned to break down those binaries rather than to reinforce them and say, I'm here to defend them against the opposing camp. And that's why the dialogue that I'm doing with Susanna is very important, because it is,
important.
I mean,
But Tarek, we have one more question from someone who hasn't spoken yet. Gertrude, could you turn on your camera and ask Tarek your question?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm Gertrude Wille from Vienna, Austria, and Jack invited me to take part because I have experience with working with a Syrian refugee boy. And one of the main questions was that it was very important to connect this trauma. Two of his little brothers were killed when they were running on the street in Syria, and he felt guilty because he was the oldest one and very jealous of these two little sweet boys. And just in a few sessions, it was by following his play, it was able to connect it with his way of expressing it by a sort of symbolic equation. He was lying down on the floor, motionless for 1 hour, as if he were one of the dead brothers, and he could express it. I wanted to also to be killed. I didn't want to survive. Why did they leave me back? I would also like to be. And he was convinced that his parents would have preferred the little ones to survive and not him. So it was also very important to work with the parents who just put the pictures of the dead boys on the wall as if they were saints, and he felt he was unwanted. And it was very important to discuss it with the parents who had not the slightest idea that how important it was for the parents to tell the boy, we are happy that you are alive. Very simple things. And the second point is that it was important to allow him to express his anger. He was angry. He wanted to be back in Syria. He didn't want to live in Austria. He didn't, although he was perfect in German, within 2 years but he had a block in learning. And after this, just 5 sessions we did, he could really explain his situation. The teacher was very helpful. He asked the whole class to write about a very important event, and he wrote about this killing of his brothers and his coming in a little boat to Austria and so on. And then the whole class could integrate him. And I was very impressed, but I only know the chapter Jack sent us. I was very impressed by this because in a way, as far as I understood, this attack 9/11 forced you somehow to rethink about your identity and to accept. That's the way what I took out of your chapter, as if this aggressive act you couldn't just say, now I belong to America and I'm an American citizen and so on, but really to go back to your roots. And this, I would like, maybe you can explore it more in detail, because it must be very ambivalent to be forced by this terrible attack, killing hundreds of people, thousands of people. And how could you connect with both sides? Be critical about this aggression and identify with the Arabic roots of you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I wrote actually an article called Teaching Humor in Arabic Literature, and it was about the response to 9/11, because you had all these there is a group, a comedy group that came on the scene in New York called the Axis of Comedy, the Axis of Evil comedy group. So they're playing on the whole Bush, you know, the axis of evil, but turning it into jokes. And it was one way of actually kind of confronting this overload of stereotypes and and scrutiny about being from that part of the world and so on. So I kind of wrote actually about this, and I use Freud's essay on humor as well, about how do you kind of take the stereotype and then break it apart, and how to undo it, how to hack it. This is something also I was very interested in academically. It's like, I'm gonna give you something that appears as what it is that you think, but the minute you're gonna look at it, you're gonna start seeing things that are, you're gonna start seeing the contradictions, and eventually you're gonna rethink your expectation about what this means and its association with violence or fanaticism or what have you. And so this is kind of my work in Arabic literature that has moved, that has brought the tools, the theoretical tools, the analytical tools from my training as in philosophy to Arabic, and say, okay, we're not going to read this text and trace it to some genealogy in the 11th century and say, this is where it comes from, and it's fixed and it's clear and it's an annotated edition, which is how a lot of the scholarship of that part of the world was done. I'm going to actually, start with this, signifier and basically find multiple trajectories that might link it to French literature, that might link it to TV series, that might link it to things that you would not expect. So really create a kind of a crisis of identity that prevents you from recognizing that which you want to recognize and associate with something that is, monolithic in its construction, clear, Islam versus modernity, all these binaries that I say I kind of go after in my work. And also how to start.
Tarek. Also, we're running out. One more thing. Go ahead. You got it.
They're very long-winded. Or your analysts. I mean, and now I have the seat, and then you just, and then I forgot.
Habibi, we
I'll stop. I was going, but
we have to stop. I'm sorry we can't get to this. Somebody else has their hand up. I'm sorry. Tarek, if you want, we can, people can reach out to me. And I can share it, and I can forward your questions to Tarek. I'm putting my email address in the chat. I've also put in the chat the links to download the chapter for those of you who have not read the chapter. And also, someone asked a question, Patricia asked a question, could we know the name of the poet who appeared in Tarek's dream?
Rambo. Etel Adnan, sorry. Etel, can I write it in the chat?
Yeah, go ahead.
Etel.
And in the meantime, Agustin, you could put up the slide. Agustin? Okay. So just to let everybody know, our next journal club is on December 13th. We will be having Dorothy Holmes, who will be talking about the American Psychoanalytics Holmes Commission report. I hope you can join us there. Tarek, thank you so much. I'm sorry to cut you off at the end.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jack, for.
Okay. Thank you all for coming. Thank you. Bye.